The pain avoidants never admit when they miss you. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't cry out loud. It doesn't text at 2 a.m. It doesn't beg. It doesn't say, I miss you, and yet it's there. When an avoidant misses you, the pain doesn't show up the way you expect. It hides behind silence, behind busyness, behind the calm mask of I'm fine. But make no mistake, missing you still hurts. Avoidants feel deeply, even if they've trained themselves not to show it. They don't lack emotion, they lack safety with emotion. So when you're gone, the pain doesn't move outward, it turns inward. They miss you in the quiet moments they never share with anyone, in the pause before they fall asleep, in the memory of a laugh they can't recreate with someone else. But here's the part they never admit. Missing you threatens their sense of control. To reach out would mean vulnerability. To admit they care would mean risking dependence, and dependence to them feels dangerous, even when love is real. So instead of coming closer, they pull further away. Instead of saying, I miss you, they convince themselves they don't need you. Instead of grieving the connection, they minimize it. And that's the tragedy. Because the pain avoidants feel isn't just missing you, it's missing the version of themselves that felt safe with you, the openness they allowed, the warmth they almost trusted. They don't just lose the relationship, they lose access to a part of their heart they briefly let out. And here's the hardest truth of all. Their silence is not proof you didn't matter. Often, it's proof that you mattered too much. So if you're waiting for them to admit their pain, to finally say what they feel, understand this. Some people would rather live with the ache of missing you than face the fear of needing you. And that choice says everything about their wounds and nothing about your worth. Avoidants feel deeply, even when it appears they don't feel at all. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about emotionally avoidant people. From the outside, their calmness can look like indifference. Their silence can be mistaken for relief. Their ability to carry on with life can feel like proof that the connection never mattered. But internally, the experience is far more complex and far more emotional than they ever let on. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion. They are disconnected from the expression of emotion. Early in life, they learned, often unconsciously, that showing need, longing, or emotional dependence was unsafe or unrewarded. As a result, they developed an internal system where feelings are managed privately rather than shared. Pain is not something they externalize. It is something they contain, compartmentalize, and attempt to outthink. When an avoidant misses someone, the sensation does not translate into action. It doesn't become a message sent, a call made, or a moment of vulnerability. Instead, it becomes a quiet tension in the body, a restlessness they can't fully name, a sense of distraction that appears during moments of stillness. They may replay memories without labeling them as longing. They may feel an absence without admitting what's absent. This internalization of pain creates the illusion that they are unaffected. In reality, they are highly affected, but in a way that is invisible to others. While someone more emotionally expressive might process loss through tears or conversation, avoidants process it through suppression and mental distance. They keep themselves busy, not because they've moved on, but because stillness brings emotions they don't feel equipped to handle. Their silence is often misread as strength. In truth, it is a coping mechanism. Silence allows them to avoid the vulnerability of admitting they care. Speaking about missing someone would require acknowledging emotional dependency, and for avoidance, dependency feels like danger. It threatens the independence they've built their emotional safety around. This is why avoidants rarely reach out when they miss someone. Reaching out would mean opening a door they worked hard to keep closed. It would mean facing the fear that once they let emotion out, they won't be able to contain it again. So instead of expressing longing, they downplay it. They tell themselves they're better off. They rationalize the separation. They replace emotional processing with intellectual explanations. Yet the feelings do not disappear. They simply go underground. They resurface in unexpected ways: irritability, emotional numbness, sudden withdrawal from others, or an unexplained heaviness that lingers. Avoidants may not cry over someone, but they often feel a dull ache that follows them quietly through daily life. They may not admit to missing someone, but they feel the disruption of connection all the same. What makes this especially painful for those who love them is that avoidants rarely offer visible reassurance. The lack of communication can feel like rejection, even when the internal experience is one of conflict and longing. But avoidance is not the absence of feeling. It is the fear of feeling without control. Understanding this doesn't excuse emotional unavailability, but it reframes it. The avoidance pain is real, even if it's hidden. Their missing you is real, even if it's never spoken. And their silence is not a lack of depth. It is evidence of a person who learned that the safest way to survive emotion was to endure it alone. For pain avoidants, admitting they miss someone is not a simple emotional confession, it feels like. Surrendering control. Control is the cornerstone of their emotional safety. It is how they regulate closeness, manage anxiety, and protect themselves from vulnerability. When they feel themselves missing you, it creates an internal conflict. The desire for connection clashes with a deep-seated fear of dependence. And when those two forces collide, control becomes their shield. From their perspective, missing someone is not just a feeling, it is a threat. To say I miss you would mean acknowledging that another person has emotional power over them. It would mean admitting that their emotional state is influenced by someone else's presence or absence. For pain avoidants, that realization is deeply uncomfortable because it contradicts the identity they have built around self-sufficiency. Many avoidants learned early on that relying on others led to disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional overwhelm. Over time, they adapted by convincing themselves they didn't need anyone. Independence became not just a preference, but a survival strategy. So when they miss you, it shakes that foundation. It reminds them that they are not as invulnerable as they want to believe. This is why admitting they miss you often feels more dangerous than losing the relationship itself. Loss is familiar. Emotional exposure is not. Loss can be endured in private, but vulnerability requires being seen. It requires letting someone witness their emotional need, and that level of visibility feels unsafe to someone who equates closeness with potential pain. Instead of leaning into the feeling, avoidants try to regain control by distancing themselves. They reduce communication. They emotionally shut down. They may become more rational, more detached, more focused on logic than feeling. This isn't because the longing isn't there, it's because acknowledging it would mean relinquishing emotional authority over themselves. Control also gives avoidants the illusion that they are choosing distance rather than being affected by it. If they admit they miss you, it reframes the separation as something happening to them, not something they are managing. And that loss of agency is intolerable. So they rewrite the narrative internally. They didn't need the connection. It wasn't that deep. It's better this way. This internal reframing is not coldness. It is self-preservation. Pain avoidants believe that once they admit how much they care, they will be exposed to rejection, disappointment, or emotional chaos. They fear that if they let themselves feel fully, they won't be able to contain the intensity. Control, to them, is the difference between stability and emotional collapse. What's often misunderstood is that their distance is not confidence. It's fear disguised as composure. Their restraint is not clarity. It's an attempt to keep emotions from overwhelming them. By refusing to admit they miss you, they maintain a sense of internal order, even as the emotional cost quietly accumulates. And so, rather than reaching out, they sit with the longing in silence. Rather than risking vulnerability, they choose emotional isolation. Control becomes more important than connection, not because they don't value love, but because they don't trust it to be safe once they fully let it in. This is the paradox of pain avoidance. They crave connection as deeply as anyone else, but the moment it begins to matter, they retreat. Admitting they miss you would mean admitting they care. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional self-reliance, that admission feels like standing unprotected in the very place they learned to guard most fiercely. When pain avoidants miss someone, they are often missing far more than the person themselves. What they struggle to name is that the connection awakened a version of themselves they don't easily access alone. With you, they may have felt lighter, more open, more expressive, or more emotionally present than usual. That version of them wasn't accidental. It was a response to feeling safe enough to soften. And when the relationship ends or distance appears, they don't just lose you, they lose that access point to themselves. Avoidants typically operate in a tightly controlled emotional range. They manage closeness carefully, allowing only what feels tolerable and predictable. But certain connections bypass those defenses, not through force, but through consistency, warmth, and emotional safety. In those moments, the avoidant may find themselves sharing more, laughing more freely, or feeling a sense of calm they rarely experience. They may not consciously register this shift while it's happening, but its absence is felt deeply once it's gone. This loss can be confusing for them because it doesn't fit their internal narrative of independence. They may believe they are self-contained, emotionally sufficient on their own. Yet with you, something different emerged. They felt seen without pressure, accepted without demand. That experience quietly contradicts the story they've told themselves about not needing closeness. When the relationship ends, the discomfort isn't just emotional attachment, it's the disorientation of returning to a more restricted version of themselves. They may find that life feels flatter afterward, less vibrant, more guarded, but instead of recognizing this as grief, they often rationalize it as relief or normalcy. They tell themselves they're simply returning to baseline. In reality, they are retreating into emotional armor that once kept them safe but now feels subtly confining. They don't miss the vulnerability itself. They miss the ease that came with not having to protect themselves. Vase so intensely. What makes this particularly difficult is that avoidants are often uncomfortable acknowledging growth that came from connection. To admit that someone helped them access a better version of themselves feels dangerously close to admitting dependence. So rather than honoring what the relationship gave them internally, they minimize it. They downplay the depth of the bond. They convince themselves that what they felt was temporary or situational, not meaningful. Yet the memory lingers, not always as longing for you specifically, but as a quiet awareness that something is missing. They may notice that conversations with others don't flow the same way. That laughter feels more restrained. That emotional openness requires more effort. These are not conscious comparisons, but emotional echoes of a self that once felt more alive. In this way, missing you becomes intertwined with missing themselves, the version of them that trusted a little more, the version that allowed closeness without panic, the version that felt emotionally connected without losing autonomy. That self didn't disappear. It simply retreated when safety felt uncertain again. Avoidants often struggle to recreate that state on their own because it was relationally activated. It emerged in response to being met, not in isolation. And that realization can be unsettling. It challenges the belief that emotional wholeness must be self-generated. Rather than exploring that truth, many avoidants retreat further into independence, doubling down on self-reliance as a way to avoid confronting what they've lost. So when they miss you, it's not always about wanting the relationship back in a traditional sense. It's about mourning the part of themselves that felt more connected, more human, more emotionally available. And because that grief is tied to vulnerability, it often goes unspoken. They don't articulate it. They don't reach out. They carry it quietly, convincing themselves they've moved on, even as they subtly long for the version of themselves that only emerged when you were there. Silence from a pain avoidant is often interpreted as indifference, but in many cases it is a form of self-protection. When emotional intensity rises, their instinct is not to reach out, explain, or seek reassurance. Their instinct is to retreat. Pulling back feels safer than staying present in a space where feelings might overwhelm them or expose them to vulnerability they don't know how to manage. For avoidance, emotional closeness can trigger a sense of danger rather than comfort. This doesn't mean they don't value connection. It means their nervous system associates intimacy with potential loss of control, rejection, or emotional pain. When they begin to miss someone, that feeling alone can feel destabilizing. Silence becomes a way to regulate themselves, to regain a sense of balance when emotions start to feel too big. This is why their withdrawal often happens precisely when the connection mattered most. When emotions deepen, the stakes feel higher. The possibility of needing someone or being affected by their absence brings up fears that may not even be conscious. Instead of naming those fears, avoidants default to distance. Silence creates space between them and the emotional trigger, even if that space also increases longing. From the outside, this can feel deeply confusing. You may wonder how someone who once seemed connected can suddenly disappear. You may assume that if they cared, they would speak up. But for avoidants, speaking up means stepping into emotional exposure. Silence allows them to avoid the risk of saying the wrong thing, feeling too much, or being seen in a moment of emotional need. Their silence is not passive, it is active self-regulation. It is a way of calming an internal alarm system that perceives closeness as threat. By not responding, not initiating, not explaining, they regain a sense of emotional control. Unfortunately, this strategy often comes at the cost of the connection itself. Avoidants are also highly skilled at minimizing their own feelings. Silence gives them time to rationalize what they're experiencing. They tell themselves the longing will pass, that it's better not to reopen old wounds, that reaching out would only complicate things. These thoughts help them justify staying quiet, even when part of them wants to connect. What's rarely understood is that silence doesn't erase emotion, it postpones it. The feelings don't disappear, they simply get stored away. Over time, this can lead to emotional numbness or a persistent sense of emptiness. But in the moment, silence feels like relief. It feels like choosing safety over uncertainty. This pattern also explains why avoidants often re-emerge later, sometimes unexpectedly. Once the emotional intensity has settled and they feel regulated again, the longing may resurface in a less threatening form. But by then, the damage caused by the earlier silence may already be done. The other person has interpreted the withdrawal as a lack of care and has begun to detach. For those on the receiving end, it's important to recognize that silence is not always a message about worth. It is often a message about fear. Avoidants are not trying to punish or manipulate. They are trying to survive emotionally using the tools they have. Unfortunately, those tools prioritize self-protection over connection. Understanding this doesn't mean accepting emotional unavailability or excusing the hurt caused by withdrawal. It means seeing the behavior clearly for what it is. Silence is not the absence of feeling. It is a barrier placed around feeling. It is the avoidance way of staying safe in a world where closeness once felt too costly to trust. One of the most painful misunderstandings in relationships with pain avoidants is the belief that their inability to reach out reflects your value to them. When someone stays silent, pulls away, or fails to fight for the connection, it's easy to internalize that behavior as a verdict on your worth. But in the case of avoidance, their withdrawal is far more about their internal fears than about the importance of the bond you shared. Avoidants operate from a deeply ingrained belief that closeness leads to pain. This belief is not usually conscious or logical, it is emotional and experiential. Somewhere along the way, they learned that needing someone came with consequences: disappointment, rejection, emotional overwhelm, or loss of autonomy. As a result, their nervous system equates emotional reliance with danger. When a relationship starts to matter, fear quietly replaces comfort. Because of this, reaching out becomes an emotionally loaded act. To initiate contact would mean acknowledging that you still affect them. It would mean admitting that the connection holds power, and for avoidance, that power feels threatening. They fear that once they open the door, they will be pulled back into feelings they don't know how to manage or boundaries they don't trust themselves to maintain. This fear often masquerades as detachment. Avoidants may appear confident, resolved, or unmoved. In reality, they are often battling an internal tug-of-war between wanting closeness and fearing it. Their silence is not a calm decision rooted in certainty. It is a defensive response rooted in anxiety. The absence of action is not proof of absence of care. What makes this especially painful is that avoidants rarely explain their internal experience. They don't say, "I want to reach out, but I'm scared." They don't admit, "I still care, but I don't know how to stay emotionally safe." Instead, they say nothing, and that nothingness leaves space for you to fill in the blanks with self-blame. The truth is, avoidance can deeply value someone and still feel incapable of sustaining emotional closeness. Their limitations are about capacity, not significance. They may lack the emotional tools to navigate vulnerability, communicate needs, or tolerate emotional dependency. That lack does not negate the impact you had on them. It highlights the areas where they feel most exposed. It's also important to understand that avoidants often judge themselves harshly for these limitations. Their withdrawal is not always accompanied by relief. Sometimes it comes with shame, frustration, or a sense of failure they don't articulate. They may believe they are not built for deep connection, reinforcing the cycle of distance rather than challenging it. For the person on the receiving end, separating your worth from their behavior is essential. If you measure your value by their ability to show up, you hand your self-esteem over to someone who struggles to access their own emotions. Their silence does not define your desirability, your lovability, or the authenticity of the connection you offered. Understanding. This doesn't mean waiting indefinitely or sacrificing your own emotional needs. It means recognizing that you cannot heal someone else's fear by proving your worth harder. Avoidants don't withdraw because you weren't enough. They withdraw because closeness asked more of them than they felt capable of giving. Their inability to reach out is a reflection of unresolved attachment wounds, not a lack of feeling. And while that doesn't lessen the pain of being left in silence, it reframes the story. The distance you experienced was not a measure of your value. It was a mirror of their fear. One of the quiet realities of loving a pain avoidant is that closure rarely arrives in the form you hope for. There is often no final conversation that neatly explains what happened, no emotional confession that validates your experience, no clear acknowledgement of the depth of the bond. And for many people, this absence becomes its own source of pain. They wait for understanding from the very person who struggles most to offer it. Pain avoidants are not wired to provide emotional resolution during moments of vulnerability. When a relationship ends or distance grows, their instinct is to move away from emotional processing, not toward it. Closure requires reflection, openness, and emotional risk, all things that activate their defenses. So instead of engaging, they withdraw, leaving unanswered questions in their wake. This can trap you in a cycle of waiting for a message, waiting for an apology, waiting for them to finally say what the relationship meant. The hope is that if they acknowledge the pain or the love, it will make everything make sense. But for avoidance, providing that clarity often feels like reopening a wound they are desperate to keep closed. What's important to recognize is that their inability to offer closure is not a deliberate cruelty, it's a limitation. They often don't fully understand their own emotions, let alone know how to articulate them to someone else. Asking them to give you emotional resolution is like asking someone who avoids pain to willingly step into it. The danger lies in tying your healing to their readiness. When your sense of peace depends on their response, you remain emotionally tethered to someone who has already chosen distance. This keeps the power outside of you, reinforcing the same imbalance that likely existed in the relationship itself. True closure does not come from them explaining why they left, why hey stayed silent, or why they couldn't show up differently. It comes from accepting who they are emotionally capable of being. It comes from recognizing patterns rather than waiting for promises. It comes from honoring your own experience, even if it's never validated by them. This doesn't mean minimizing what you shared or pretending it didn't matter. It means allowing yourself to define the meaning of the relationship without their permission. The connection was real because you felt it. The effort mattered because you gave it. The loss hurts because something meaningful existed, regardless of whether they can admit it. Reclaiming your power often involves grieving not just the person, but the hope that they would eventually meet you emotionally. Letting go of that hope can be painful, but it's also freeing. It allows you to stop interpreting silence as something you need to solve and start seeing it as information about what they can offer. When you choose to create your own closure, you shift from waiting to healing. You stop asking why you weren't enough and start asking what you need to feel whole again. You stop seeking answers from someone who avoids introspection and start listening to your own clarity. Closure in this sense is an internal decision. It's the moment you accept that understanding does not require their participation, that peace does not depend on their growth, that your healing can move forward even if they remain emotionally unavailable. And in choosing that, you do something powerful. You stop abandoning yourself in the hope that someone else will finally choose you. In the end, understanding pain avoidance is not about excusing silence or justifying emotional distance. It's about freeing yourself from the story that their inability to show up was a reflection of your worth. What they never admit, what they struggle to face is rooted in fear, not in a lack of feeling. And when you stop waiting for acknowledgement from someone who avoids vulnerability, you reclaim your power, your clarity, and your peace. Thank you for listening, for allowing space for this truth, and for choosing to honor your own emotional needs with courage and self-respect.